When that arrogant billionaire CEO threatened to fire me on the spot for daring to work from home, I quietly agreed to follow his exact command. And by the end of the very next business day, his entire $40 million enterprise was completely paralyzed. Some executives honestly believe they own the lives of the people who make them rich, just like our narcissistic chief executive officer Marcus Sterling, who learned the absolute hardest way possible that treating your top senior systems architect like a disposable slave is a massive mistake. Marcus had spent the previous 6 months aggressively trying to prove he was a visionary tech genius by forcing every single remote worker back into our cramped downtown headquarters 5 days a week, canceling all hybrid schedules with zero warning, and openly mocking anyone with legitimate family or health concerns as weak and lazy. I had been running the core infrastructure of the entire corporation for over 8 years, keeping our global cloud servers, custom enterprise resource planning software, and high-frequency financial transaction pipelines running smoothly 24 hours a day. Because my job required late-night emergency deployments across international time zones, my employment contract explicitly allowed me to work remotely from my home office setup, which featured redundant fiber internet connections and enterprise-grade power backups that our main corporate office building honestly lacked. Marcus did not care about contracts or operational continuity or logic because he was driven purely by fragile ego and a pathological need to physically see people sitting at their desks like caged animals so he could feel important. On a Tuesday morning, Marcus stormed into my workspace while I was deep in the middle of diagnosing a complex latency spike in our primary database cluster, slamming his designer coffee cup onto my desk and demanding to know why my face was not physically present in the building on a Monday when he had hosted an optional breakfast meeting that I had dialed into remotely while finishing a critical server migration. I looked up from my dual monitors, calmly explaining that my contract permitted remote work and that I had spent the previous night fixing a security vulnerability that could have cost the company millions if left unpatched. Marcus turned completely purple with rage, leaning over my partition, pointing a shaking finger directly in my face, and screaming at the top of his lungs that he did not care about my contract or my security fixes or my past contributions, telling me that as of this exact second, every single remote work agreement in the entire company was permanently revoked, and if I was not sitting at my assigned physical desk in this exact room by 8 o'clock sharp the following morning, I would be fired for gross insubordination without severance, without benefits, and with a black mark on my professional record. I stared right into his furious eyes, felt a strange wave of complete calm wash over me, and gave him the exact response he desperately wanted to hear, telling him quietly and respectfully that I understood completely, that I would be at my desk by 8 o'clock the next morning, and that his new rule would be followed to the absolute letter without a single exception. Marcus smirked with supreme arrogance, patting my shoulder patronizingly, telling me that it was about time someone taught my generation some discipline, and turning on his heel to walk away to terrorize someone else. He had no earthly idea that my malicious compliance was about to trigger an unstoppable corporate catastrophe. You see, the headquarters building had just undergone a massive and completely botched networking overhaul managed by Marcus's nephew, a 24-year-old unqualified frat boy who had installed cheap consumer-grade routers and completely gutted our redundant power backup systems to save a few $1,000s in corporate budget. That botched setup meant the physical office network suffered from constant rolling power outages, catastrophic packet loss, and zero external VPN access due to firewall configurations that blocked all secure remote connections from outside the building. When Marcus issued his iron-fisted mandate requiring everyone to be physically present, he also inadvertently created a strict operational silo where absolutely zero system maintenance, emergency patching, or database optimization could legally or technically be performed outside the four walls of the headquarters building during standard business hours. For years, I had performed all major system updates, security patches, and heavy infrastructure maintenance between midnight and 4 in the morning from my home office, when user traffic was at absolute zero and server loads were minimal, ensuring that a reboot or an unexpected crash would never impact our daily operations or our multi-million-dollar clients. By demanding that I be physically seated at my desk from 8 in the morning until 5 in the evening, Marcus had effectively locked my hands behind my back, prohibiting me from performing the vital nocturnal maintenance that kept the entire $40 million enterprise breathing. That evening I packed up my personal belongings from my home desk, packed my specialized diagnostic thumb drives, and prepared to follow his precious rule down to the very last microscopic detail. The next morning, I arrived at the downtown headquarters building precisely at 7:55, swiped my security badge, walked straight past the trembling receptionists, and sat down at my assigned metal desk in the cavernous, freezing open-plan office space. The air conditioning was broken as usual. The ambient noise from dozens of panicked sales reps shouting over each other was deafening, and the Wi-Fi network dropped every 7 minutes like clockwork due to the cheap routers Marcus' nephew had installed. At exactly 8 o'clock, Marcus walked past my row, spotted me sitting upright at my desk with my laptop open, and gave me a smug, triumphant nod of approval, clearly believing he had successfully broken my spirit and forced me into complete submission. I smiled politely back, opened my terminal window, and immediately began my normal daily routine, but with one critical difference: I strictly limited my work to the exact hours of 8 to 5, refused to touch a single server outside those hours, and executed every administrative command with agonizing, hyper-literal obedience. By 10 in the morning, the first major crack in the foundation appeared when our largest enterprise client, a massive healthcare logistics provider representing 30% of our annual revenue, attempted to upload their daily batch of critical shipping manifests into our database system, because the office network bandwidth was being completely choked by hundreds of employees streaming music, watching training videos, and downloading massive software updates simultaneously over the substandard routers. The upload timed out and crashed the primary database server. Under normal circumstances, I would have immediately logged into my secure home server at 2 in the morning, isolated the bottleneck, reallocated bandwidth, and run a clean diagnostic script to restore the pipeline within 5 minutes. But because Marcus had strictly forbidden me from working outside the physical office or outside standard business hours, and because my remote access credentials had been automatically revoked by his new security directive at 8 o'clock that morning, I simply sat quietly at my desk, folded my hands neatly across my keyboard, and watched the error logs scroll across my screen without lifting a finger to fix it. Within 10 minutes, our frantic director of operations came running over to my desk, sweating profusely and shouting that the healthcare client portal was completely down, and that millions of dollars in perishable medical shipments were currently stranded in transit because the system refused to process their data. He demanded to know why I was not fixing it immediately, and I simply looked him dead in the eye and reminded him in a clear, level voice that our esteemed chief executive officer had explicitly prohibited any off-site work, any after-hours troubleshooting, and any remote system access under threat of immediate termination for gross insubordination. The director stared at me in absolute horror, stammered that this was an emergency, and begged me to bypass the rule just this once, but I shook my head firmly, pointed to the large compliance poster hanging on the wall right above my desk that Marcus had ordered installed everywhere, and stated loudly enough for half the floor to hear that I valued my job too much to violate the chief executive officer's direct personal mandate. The director cursed under his breath, spun around, and sprinted toward Marcus's executive corner office on the top floor to beg for emergency authorization. While that was happening, the second domino fell in our financial transaction processing pipeline, which relied on an automated script that had historically run every day at 10:30 a.m. from a secure background server. Because that script required a manual security token authentication that could only be verified through my authenticated admin terminal, and because my terminal was currently choked by the office network traffic collapse caused by the cheap routers, the script failed to execute, freezing $3 million in pending merchant payouts across the entire eastern seaboard. Bank representatives began calling our corporate finance department in absolute panic, threatening to freeze our merchant accounts and report us for severe regulatory noncompliance if our payment gateway was not restored within the hour. Our chief financial officer, a notoriously high-strung executive who cared about nothing except quarterly bonuses, rushed out of his office with his phone glued to his ear, screaming at the top of his lungs and demanding to know why the payment servers were unresponsive. He spotted me sitting calmly at my desk sipping my lukewarm water, marched over, slammed his palm onto my partition, and demanded to know why I was sitting there doing nothing while the company was actively bleeding money by the second. I repeated the exact same phrase, telling him with absolute politeness that Marcus had explicitly ordered all systems management to be conducted exclusively from physical workstations during standard business hours without any remote overrides. And since the office network bandwidth was currently hovering at 0% efficiency due to hardware limitations, my hands were entirely tied by company policy. The chief financial officer turned an alarming shade of crimson, grabbed me by the shoulder, and ordered me to fix it right now or he would personally ensure I never worked in this industry again. I calmly shrugged off his hand, adjusted my collar, and suggested that he take his complaint directly to Marcus, since Marcus was the architect of the exact policy that was currently preventing any emergency remediation from taking place. Before the chief financial officer could formulate a response, the building public address system crackled to life, and the emergency alarm klaxon began blaring a deafening, high-pitched wail throughout the entire facility. The cheap power distribution units installed by Marcus, his nephew, had completely overheated under the sudden strain of powering every single employee's workstation, peripheral monitor, and personal device simultaneously, causing a total electrical short circuit that knocked out the main server room air conditioning units. Within 3 minutes, the temperature inside the core server room spiked past 110 degrees Fahrenheit, triggering the thermal safety shutdown protocols on our 3 main enterprise storage arrays to prevent permanent hardware meltdown. Every single internal database, customer CRM record, payroll file, and active project management board went completely dark simultaneously, plunging the entire $40 million enterprise into absolute Stone Age darkness. The office descended into sheer, unadulterated chaos as hundreds of panic-stricken employees stood up from their desks, shouting at each other, waving their arms, and wandering aimlessly through the hallways like lost sheep, while the emergency backup generators failed to kick in because Marcus had cut their maintenance budget the previous month. Through the glass walls of his corner office on the top floor, I could clearly see Marcus Sterling packing back and forth like a caged tiger, frantically slamming his fists against his executive glass panel, screaming into his smartphone while his face twisted in absolute terror as he realized his precious empire was actively disintegrating right before his eyes. 10 minutes later, the elevator doors banged open and Marcus came storming down the stairs and across the open floor, his expensive designer suit wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes wide with stark, naked panic. He marched straight up to my desk, breathless and shaking with unbridled fury, and screamed at me to get into the server room right this second and fix everything or he would call the police and have me arrested for sabotage. I did not flinch, I did not blink, and I did not break my calm, steady gaze as I looked up at the billionaire tyrant who had tried to crush me just 24 hours earlier. I stood up slowly from my chair, buttoned my jacket, and spoke in a clear, conversational tone that cut cleanly through the surrounding noise of the screaming employees and blaring alarms. I looked him straight in the eye and told him that I would be more than happy to enter the server room, diagnose the hardware failure, reboot the storage arrays, and restore the entire corporate infrastructure right now, but only on 2 very specific conditions that I wanted clearly understood by everyone within earshot. Marcus, desperate and willing to agree to anything to save his crumbling company, stammered frantically that I could have whatever I wanted, a raise, a promotion, a corner office, just fix the damn servers before the board of directors found out. I shook my head slowly, smiled, and delivered the final blow that would seal his corporate execution. I told him that my first condition was a signed, permanent exemption from his ridiculous return to office mandate, allowing me to work exclusively from my home office where my redundant infrastructure actually functioned without melting down. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, I stated my second condition, which was a formal written apology delivered to the entire company inbox acknowledging that his arrogant policy had caused the multi-million-dollar outage, and that all future technical decisions would be left to qualified professionals instead of incompetent family members. The surrounding employees who had gathered around to watch the confrontation went dead silent, holding their breath as they waited to see how the arrogant billionaire would handle the ultimate humiliation. Marcus looked around at the sea of expectant faces, looked at the smoking server room door, looked at his phone which was vibrating incessantly with urgent calls from angry board members and major clients, and realized with crushing certainty that he had completely trapped himself in his own web of corporate tyranny. His shoulders slumped, the arrogant fire in his eyes completely extinguished, and he nodded slowly in absolute defeat, whispering hoarsely that I had won and that he would sign whatever I wanted within the hour. I picked up my diagnostic thumb drive from my desk, walked past him without another word, stepped into the scorching server room, and calmly spent the next 4 hours restoring the entire digital infrastructure while Marcus sat at his desk, drafting his humiliating company-wide confession letter. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, every system was back online, every client portal was fully restored, and every merchant payment had cleared, but the corporate landscape had shifted permanently under our feet. Marcus kept his promise, signing my permanent remote work exemption and issuing the public apology the very next morning before quietly stepping down from his chief executive officer position under immense pressure from an enraged board of directors who had discovered the true financial cost of his disastrous ego trip. As I sat comfortably in my quiet, air-conditioned home office sipping my morning coffee while accessing the perfectly humming corporate servers without a single interruption, my phone buzzed with a notification from our lead human resources director asking if I would be interested in interviewing for the newly vacant chief technology officer position. I smiled, deleted the message, opened my music playlist, and happily went back to doing my job in peace.